So this is the key point that I will try to make during this whole talk, is that your health is largely dictated by your choices, not your doctor's choices. I think that's a critical element, because it requires planning, discipline, thought process. You have to make this statement work, you've got to say, my health is important and it's my responsibility, which isn't always comfortable, because a lot of people have thought that my health is my doctor's concern. You know, they tell me to take a drug, I take the drug. And I'm arguing that that's actually probably not a safe approach. So one of the interesting incidents, I'll be sort of talking through the slides. I'm not going to go point by point. So, but if you want a copy of my slides and see if I'm telling the truth or not, just put your email address or address down and we'll send you a copy. You can get a copy of this there, but this will be on video, so you can check it to show your lawyer. And so on. So, whenever anybody tells you anything about health, we would argue that they should be able to support whatever they're saying by at least 3 lines of evidence. And the lines of evidence might be, what have humans always done? So for example, humans have pretty much always eaten olive oil and tomatoes. And so anybody who comes and tells you that olive oil or tomatoes are bad for you, that would be a tricky thing to defend, because there is already one strong line of evidence to say that they're wrong. And then you look for things like studies, you look for things like common sense, what you see around you in terms of people doing well or not doing well. So if somebody in the audience has type 2 diabetes, and somebody says, you know, if you eat right and exercise and lose some inches around your waist, you maybe don't have to have type 2 diabetes. Well, you know, wouldn't that be worth investigating? And I can show you 3 lines of evidence that show that that's correct. So, so always be cynical about what anybody is telling you, whether it's a physician or a friend, and say to yourself, can this be supported by multiple lines of evidence? And I'm not going to give all that many studies, but this is a useful study to know about. And what it is a study that looked at about 120,000 people, and they're followed for like between 20 and 30 years. And they said, in this huge group of people who we know a lot about, and the way we know a lot about them is because they study these people every couple of years, find out what they've eaten, what kind of disease processes, what medicines they take, and so on. And they said, out of this group of people, who's the healthiest? And this is very reproducible data, incidentally. Multiple studies around the world have shown the same thing about what I'm about to say, and that is that people that followed a good diet, and this was not an exotic diet, right? They ate things like fruits and vegetables and beans and grains and dairy and meat, right? Just normal food. And they weren't too chubby. So they had a body mass index up to about 25. And what that basically means is you don't have a pot belly. They got 30 minutes or more of vigorous exercise a day. They didn't smoke, and they drank a small amount of alcohol. And we have I could probably point to at least 10 high-quality studies that show almost identical data. And so you look at that group of findings, so a decent diet, not much sugar, not being too chubby, getting exercise, not smoking, and drinking a small amount of alcohol. And you can say, you know, pretty much everybody can do that. And that was related to living about 12 years longer, about 80 or 90% less diabetes, stroke, heart disease, and generally a higher quality of life. Because what we should be aiming for, in my opinion, in terms of longevity, is high quality, high quality, high quality, high quality, high quality death. What we call squaring the curve, or extending your health span so your health span is as long as your lifespan, is what some people say. That kind of thing. So, so this gives us sort of a general pattern that's not real complicated. I would argue that the people that publish longevity books that say you've got to take this vitamin and have these devices and do weird practices, none of them actually can show that what they talk about actually works in the real world. The stuff that works is pretty simple. And so if we think about a whole food diet, vegetables and fruits, beans and whole grains, dairy foods, especially cultured dairy like yogurt and kefir and cheese. Other cultured foods such as sauerkraut, because your gut health depends on having bugs, good bugs. And the good bugs can come from cultured food like sauerkraut, and it can come from a dirty carrot. And then traditional fats, so we don't propose a low-fat diet for anybody. For one thing, they don't taste very good. Secondly, they're not associated with better health. And so we would say traditional fats like olive oil and butter and raw nuts and oil seeds. We think oil seeds are underrated. You know, things like sunflower seeds and pumpkin seeds and things like that. Meat, chicken, and fish. So all these different foods that are kind of just normal. None of this is exotic. And just mentioning that the bugs in your gut, the reason we always talk about bugs is that your intestinal tract, all of your nutrition relies on a healthy intestinal tract. A healthy intestinal tract relies on fiber, fats, and having lots of bugs that can do the right thing for those fibers and fats and make these little short chain fatty acids that go back to your liver and your brain and make your brain work better and make your liver work better and keep your blood sugar under control and keep your appetite under control and so on. What are good fats? So we do not think that the evidence supports a low-fat diet at all, under any conditions, for anybody. And so the question is, if you're going to have fats, what are you going to have? So the strongest evidence by far is olive oil, and of all the olive oils, probably there's a benefit to extra virgin olive oil. So olive oil is number one. Butter has strong historical precedence. Probably not as good for you as olive oil, but still good for you. Raw nuts and oil seeds, so that's things like just unroasted almonds, hazelnuts, pecans, walnuts. All are consistently associated with better health outcomes as well. The dairy fats, and so when we buy dairy, for example, we buy whole milk dairy. Our line at our home is we'll start buying low-fat dairy when God starts making low-fat cows. And we're not seeing any sign that that's happening. And then, of course, fish and eggs and meat. So, you know, fish fat, so what you get with tuna or salmon or sardines. Anybody here eat sardines? Yes. Yay! You'll probably live forever. You wanted to know about seed oils. You'll notice seed oils like safflower, peanut, avocado, grapeseed. None of those are here. And the reason is these are all novel oils. So your great-grandmother didn't have clear, tasteless safflower, peanut, grapeseed, avocado, canola oil available to her, because these are all industrially processed oils. They're essentially nutrient-free, they're calorie-rich, and they're not associated with better health outcomes. The only studies we have are quite negative in terms of outcomes. So we would argue there is no good reason to recommend the modern industrially processed, what's commonly called seed oils. Remembering that olive oil is actually a fruit juice, which is kind of an intriguing thought. So artificially sweetened foods, which is what, so the diet sweet drinks, they do a couple of things. One is they maintain your sweet tooth. Secondly, they maintain your appetite. This applies to, the first studies on this were done by a lady called Suzanne Swithers in rats. And then she moved on to lawyers. But it's really interesting. You get humans or rats and you feed them more artificially sweetened foods, they tend to have a little bit more of an appetite. And so in the real world, it doesn't seem to lead to weight loss. Thirdly, they're associated with more brain problems, especially dementia, kidney problems, and the data are consistently all over the place, but they are not favorable. And then you go back to my original thing, is that anything you do should have 3 lines of evidence. Novel chemicals do not have a good record. So if you're going to bet, don't bet on something that some chemist just came up with 20 years ago. You know, it doesn't have a good track record. And so if you're going to believe the pharmaceutical industry, be my guest. But I think it's foolish to do so. And when you're drinking Diet Coke, you're believing the pharmaceutical industry. But also, if you do, it's just like a Google Scholar search on hazards from artificially sweetened foods. I think you'll I think your eyes will bug out. So we'll move on. And highly processed foods. Now this is fascinating. This is the group of foods. So these are the foods that were processed by a factory before you ate them. So it's pretty much everything that comes in a box, everything comes in a frozen meal, everything comes in a wrapper like a protein bar, like a healthy protein bar with earth tone labels. And it says protein or it says breakfast or something on it. All of those foods that have been made in a factory that are not traditional foods are strongly associated with living a shorter length of time, more depression, more dementia, more heart disease, more cancers. And not only that, but in these studies, of which there's numerous, and as far as I know, they're all consistent. I'm not aware of any. Whenever you're looking at studies, you always want to ask people who are citing a study, what do the opposing studies show? In other words, does this group of studies show this is good and this study show it's bad? In which case you have to take both into account. I'm not aware of these highly processed foods that there's any studies showing they're good. And they constitute pretty close to 2/3 of the American diet. So and many of them look like healthy foods. So we would argue that you should avoid all of the highly processed foods and instead eat foods that you recognize. Meats, fish, fruits, vegetables, beans, grains. And because traditionally prepared beans seem to be okay. There's differences in the processing. But it's a very, very fascinating area, and it really it drives you back to just eating traditional foods that your great-grandmother would recognize. And we would argue that's a very, very strong basis on which to choose food. Any other thoughts on highly processed foods? One of our pet peeves on highly processed foods is breakfast cereals. And that's coming from a guy who loves Cheerios. I get to have a box of Cheerios on my birthday. But they just are not good food. These are special occasion foods. Yeah, plain old oatmeal, or even better, oat groats. So the question is oat milk, soy milk, almond milk, and all those artificial milks. What we call fake foods, unkindly. Fake foods. So all these artificial milks, once again, they're highly processed under high heat conditions, high temperature conditions, and are part of this family of foods that are consistently associated with bad health outcomes. So we would argue you're better off with plain old cow milk. What a concept. This is a comment from my mother that I grew up with. So I grew up in an anti-medical household, which made going to medical school really interesting. But her comment was, good food is cheaper than good doctors, and a lot cheaper than bad doctors. Her degree here is a mother of 7. It's sort of like right up there with processed foods and sugars. Waistline. If you got a generous waistline, do something about it. You gotta get your weight down, and losing weight primarily relies on eating less. And so the trick is, how do you eat less and not be hungry all the time and angry with everybody? And it just so happens we have a website that's got some weight loss recommendations. I have a podcast called Make Your Own Ozempic, which can give you some ideas for weight loss. But the key issues are, get rid of the sugars, get rid of the white flour and white rice, and before you eat anything at any snack or any meal, have a generous serving of a fruit or a vegetable. So picture that you start every day with, just picture this, don't be too concrete about it, but just imagine that every day you started with 6 apples. Or it could be 2 apples and 2 bananas and 2 stalks of celery. And then before breakfast you had one of those, and before a snack you had one of those, and before lunch you had one of those, and before dinner you had one of those, and before you went to bed you had one of those, and so on. You'd be so full from the fruits and vegetables that you wouldn't eat as much. And our patients that do that reliably lose 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds a week. It does take a remarkable amount of resetting the brain. It's surprisingly hard to do. You have to be prepared, you have to think about it. but it's incredibly effective and a whole lot cheaper and a whole lot better for you than Ozempic. And it's really hard to exercise off those pounds. So if you play pickleball for an hour, you might burn a couple of 100 calories. How long does it take you to eat a Costco muffin with 700 calories? 5 minutes? And then add 200 calories of latte to that. And then you're actually kind of looking for a second muffin probably, because I mean, after all, you've just played an hour of pickleball. Don't you deserve a treat? So, don't think that you're overweight because you're not exercising enough. You might not be exercising enough. We'll get to that. But you really want to say, if I'm overweight, I need to eat less or drink less. Sweets, pastas, breads are the big one. And I should have added white rice to that category, including white basmati. Brown rice might be okay. Then it becomes, because brown rice is fundamentally good food, but it's really easy for people to eat too much of it. And so like so much else, you just need to show some self-control. And that's where the more fruits and vegetables tends to fill you up. So brown rice is probably pretty good food, but people eat generously. So the waistline, it drives high blood pressure. It drives diabetes. So about 85–90% of type 2 diabetics are diabetic because they're heavy. There's 5 or 10% that aren't. They're a special category. It drives most high blood pressure. It drives a lot of the overwhelming overuse of drugs. We'll be talking about that in a second. Your waistline drives a lot of depression. Your waistline drives a lot of knee replacements and hip replacements. So I don't think in our society we take the waistline seriously enough. It's a big deal. Big, I didn't mean that to be a pun, but anyway. Any questions about the waistline? So we're going to talk about playing games. So this guy is a ping pong champion, 93 years old. So games are really interesting as a one function of exercise. So going back for a second, remember that group of people that were the healthiest in the Nurses' Health Study included the group that got about half an hour of moderate to vigorous activity every day. And so we define moderate to vigorous activity as something that makes you short of breath. And we would argue that try to get something 3 times a day, because 3 times a day metabolically has more effect than exercising once a day, even if it's only 1 minute. And it can be doing some stairs, it can be jumping rope, it can be doing some weights, it can be playing pickleball. Just do something that makes you short of breath 3 times a day, even if it's only 1 minute. It can be just doing high steps. Doing this for a minute, it's going to look silly, but it's pretty effective exercise. So you don't cut yourself any slack on the exercise. Secondly, if you want to keep a good brain, you make sure part of your exercise involves a game that involves other people, that involves strategy and exercise. So the one that's been studied the most is actually ping pong, which is why I have that picture. But ping pong, pickleball, tennis, basketball, you name it. Think about picking up a game. If you're not already playing a game, this place has at least two ping pong tables and I believe at least 2 pickleball courts. And you don't have to. My wife over there, she and I, when we're playing ping pong, we don't usually even score. Is that correct, Anna? Yeah. We just hit it back and forth, try to do some good shots, blah, blah, blah. But we try to be active. And so it's a fabulous decision to decide that you're going to play a game frequently. And not only going to help yourself, you're going to help the poor sod that you're making play with you. So, because somebody's got to play with you in these situations. So I would argue 3 times a day, short of breath, and make sure at least one of your exercises is a game. And have as much variety as possible. So the person that does a little bit of weights, walking, some stairs, some game, is less likely to get injured than somebody who just does the same thing all the time. Plus, they're less likely to be bored. This is one of my patients who at his 88th birthday was a 15K fun run. That's about 9 miles. And how many 88-year-olds? He didn't start exercising until he was 50. His whole family flew in from all over America. It was fabulous. And a lot of this, when we think about longevity, we think about maintaining a good brain. And one of the things that really helps people maintain a good brain is a strong sense of purpose. And so if you look at people who have pathological markers for Alzheimer's disease, for example, who also have a strong sense of purpose in their life, they actually, their genes for Alzheimer's disease is less expressed. They're far less likely to get Alzheimer's disease, and so on. So think about purpose. Think about purpose that involves helping somebody else, something called eudynamic purpose. But that pattern of behavior really, and a lot of those people, you know, I'm a believer in Jesus Christ as my Savior, and this gives me a direction to go in life, a reason to do certain things and not do other things. And those that choice of being purposeful in life and not just sitting in front of a screen it seems to be extremely strongly related to a better brain over time. So this is really where kind of the rubber meets the road in terms of your decision to take control of your health. Because if you see a mounting number of medicines on your list, you've got to say, A, who's making these decisions? B, are these decisions good for me? C, does anybody know the answer to those two? So if I see a patient with 5 or 6 or 7 medications, do I have any idea, does anybody on the planet have any idea whether that's a safe combination? And the answer is no. And anybody who tells you otherwise is making it up, because nobody's ever studied these combinations in people like you. They're just a best guess. And do you want to be the victim of a best guess? I would argue you don't. So you want to be concerned about 2 things about medications. One is about direct side effects of the medications. And if you're taking a medication and you're not reading the side effects list, you're making a big mistake. Secondly, if you're taking a medication and you're not thinking about what do we not know about the drug-drug interactions, the effect of that drug on something else you're taking, then you're making a big mistake. Remembering that we actually don't know very much about drug-drug interactions. We know a little bit, and I have a fancy program that tells me whether things are safe or not. But just because they say it's safe doesn't mean they are. It just means that nobody's actually reported the death, and so on. So before anybody like me puts you on a medication, ask yourself, is it necessary? And so you say to them, hey, is this necessary? Say it's a cholesterol medicine. And you say, hey, doctor, is this medicine really necessary for me? Yes, you have high cholesterol and it'll reduce your risk of heart disease. And you say, how much will it reduce my risk of heart disease? And if they can't answer that question, are they competent to prescribe the drug? Falls, death, reduction in mental sharpness. If you're lightheaded when you stand up because of your blood pressure drug, that means your brain isn't getting enough blood. Just think about that for a second, if you can still think because you're lightheaded. You don't want to be taking a drug that reduces blood supply to your brain, I would submit. Fatigue is really common. Depression is really common from blood pressure drugs. And I don't mean to be just giving blood pressure drugs a bad time. I give all drugs a bad time. At the same time, I'm prescribing drugs every day. But I'm prescribing drugs every day with this conversation with the patient. You know, here's what we're prescribing, here's why, here's the risks, here's the benefits. You know, what do you think? And what are your options? Because if your option is to exercise more, eat more fruits and vegetables, and lose some weight, maybe that's the option you should take. This is a paper that just got published a week or 2 ago, describing how polypharmacy, the prescribing too many medications, particularly from the blood pressure class, what's called the anticholinergic class, basically heart medicines and anticholinergics, which anticholinergics are a huge range, including a lot of our bugs, drugs for our gut, a lot of our drugs for allergy are anticholinergics. Just the number of deaths related to falls from those drugs. And so having said that, let's tell you about Judy. So Judy gets dragged into my practice by her daughter, and she says, plunks her down in front of me and says, Mom can't drive anymore. And Mom's got all these bruises over her face. And I said, what happened? And she said, well, I fell down again and smashed my face on the pavement. And she had all these face and neck injuries over the last couple of months because of all these falls, lots of ER bills. And she went to her doctor, and who said, you need to get a walker and you need to stop driving. And this is a lady who's 80 and living independently, right? This was kind of a big deal. And so the doctor plunks her down in front of me and say, find out what's wrong. Well, she was on 11 prescription drugs prescribed by 4 different doctors. Nobody knew what was going on with her. And she had the mistake of trusting her doctors. That's your first mistake. And so we say to all of our patients is trust nobody, including us. Question everything. Because if you question everything, you'll get educated. Sometimes I'll be right, and sometimes I'll be wrong. Don't say anything, Mr. Ledbetter. No. So anyway, so she's on all these drugs that cause sedation, cause low blood pressure, and cause low blood sugar. So she'd been told she had diabetes, which was kind of a questionable call to start with. But she was having blood sugars that were so low that her brain wasn't working. She had blood pressure that was so low that her brain wasn't working. And she was sedated, so she couldn't catch herself when she started to fall. So she's falling all the time. So we're internal medicine people, so we do a careful exam, find out if there's anything else that we're missing that's wrong, because maybe it's not her drugs. And then we gradually get rid of about half of her drugs. She goes back living independently, back to driving, not falling anymore. So all that was happening to her was she was being poisoned. Poisoned by people who meant well. Remember, the doctors that were prescribing this weren't malignant. They weren't hoping that she would have problems. It's just the medical profession can get really sloppy. And you don't want to be the victim of sloppy doctors. And having said that, remember, all of us have been sloppy sometimes. All of us look back and say, whoa, wow, I didn't take that into account, or whatever. So, I'm as guilty as anybody of making mistakes. And that's why patients need to be thoughtful and untrusting. So we also got her on a exercise program. With exercising and eating right, she didn't have diabetes anymore. And little things got better, like she'd had bad kidneys. Her kidneys got better. Her blood pressure got better. And she just felt better. Plus, she felt really good about being able to go home and be able to drive and live independently again. We actually just saw her. This whole event was maybe 5-6 years ago, and I just saw her, and she's still doing great. Tests. A lot of people are driven crazy by tests. And so patients, I had this happen yesterday. A patient came in with all these tests that were done by a doctor in California. And I said, why did you have all these tests done? And she said, well, they didn't seem very expensive, and I thought they'd be a good idea at the time. So she had all these tests done, none of which had any meaningful value, right? None of which would actually help her be healthier in any way. And some were normal and some were abnormal and so on. And so the point I'm making is that before you have a test done, make sure it's going to actually give you a result that you want, that you're going to be able to do something with. Don't get a test just because somebody says, hey, it's time for your test. And so talk over with your doctor before you get tests. Talk them over with them and say, hey, I don't want to get any that I don't really need.
Are you talking about blood tests?
Blood tests, urine tests, imaging tests, you name it, yeah. And your doctor can, a lot of doctors, and I've been guilty of this too, get stuff, order stuff because we sort of think the patient wants it. And sometimes I'll say, hey, do you want this test? And they'll say, yeah. And I'll say, well, I wouldn't get it, but here, I'm a medical libertarian, so I'll order it for you. Sort of like I do when I'm ordering blood pressure drugs for somebody who needs to eat better and exercise more and lose 20 pounds. I say, well, I wouldn't take this drug, but if you want to take it, sure. And so then they can make a choice. They usually choose not what I'm suggesting. Sir William Osler 100 years ago was famous for saying the curious difference between humans and animals is humans really like to take medicines. So aging well, and then if anybody wants to hang around, we'll talk about nutritional supplements if you want. Somebody asked about that. So the basic thing I'm trying to say is, first of all, choose to be as healthy as you can be. We all start with a certain amount of deficiencies, right? When life moves on and we've got problems. So start with be as healthy as you can be, and that usually involves some work, some study, some thought processing, getting different people's opinions. Remembering that your choices are almost always, not always, but almost always more important than your doctor's choices. So look carefully at your diet. And I have patients who live here who have made choices, for example, not eating desserts, and everything's better. They're still eating the same food, they're just skipping the desserts and white rice. Eat fruits or vegetables and protein with every meal. Protein, especially as you get older, it's really important for maintaining muscle mass, and people often get really sloppy about it. So make sure you get some protein with every meal. Avoid sweets, breads, and pastas and white rice. Daily exercise. Don't underrate the importance of exercise, and if you're not trying to do it 3 times a day, I don't think you're trying hard enough, but I'm kind of mean. And if you're not getting short of breath, you're probably not really exercising. If you're not short of breath, you're moseying. You're showing a good effort. But you really should get short of breath. Playing a game, remember, it's really good for the brain. If you want to reduce your risk of cognitive dysfunction next year, in 5 years, in 10 years, then pick up that, go and find somebody to play that ping pong with you.
What about
And waste management.
What about board games?
Board games?
Yeah.
Board games are probably good for the brain, but they're not. They haven't been shown to have that profound effect on cognitive function that physical games have. So it looks like you have to get short of breath. And waste management. Don't sell yourself on the lie that you can't lose weight. It's a fraud, it's a lie, it's not true. And if you go to our website, there's free handouts on how to reduce your calories. If you talk to a thin person and say, hey, what do you do differently than I do if you need to lose weight? You'll often get all you need to know. And work with your doctor to minimize medications. I think it's fair to say almost all of my colleagues would agree that we should be minimizing medications. And we'll usually be pretty happy to go over that list with you and say, hey, maybe this one isn't so important. Is this, or maybe you can move to every other day on this one. For example, if I see somebody who's on Prilosec every day for heartburn, well, I'd say, hey, how about if you do this and this and this for your heartburn? And how about if we try you on every other day Prilosec and see how you do? And if they do well, we go to every 3rd day, and so on. So remember, your body doesn't like surprises. For those interested, we're going to have a talk. It'll actually be kind of similar to this, but it'll be on cancer survivorship, meaning the things that, if you've got cancer, what will improve your survival and reduce side effects of therapy, and those same things, of course, reduce your risk of getting cancer to start with. So that's going to be in a couple of weeks. And I think that's our book. That gives an overview of good lifestyle practices and a whole bunch of recipes and ideas how to put them into practice with evidence from the medical literature. This is our nonprofit educational foundation trying to put doctors out of business. Because if we can get everybody to take good care of themselves, there doesn't need to be as many people like me.
Well, thank you so much for coming, Dr. Hassel.